I never imagined that my own wedding day, the day I had dreamed about since I was a little girl twirling in my mother's veil, would become the battlefield for the most audacious betrayal I'd ever face. But that's exactly what happened when my cousin, the one person I trusted to stand beside me in every milestone, decided to steal it from me. For months, I had been carefully planning every detail of my big day. The invitations were sent out, the florist knew exactly how many ivory roses I wanted at the altar, the dress was tailored to perfection and hanging like a promise in my closet, and most importantly, I had booked a historic venue, a grand old estate just outside the city, with golden chandeliers, stained glass windows, and sprawling gardens that made you feel like royalty from another time. That venue wasn't just any backdrop. It was the centerpiece of my dream wedding, the one I had locked in 2 years in advance and made sacrifice after sacrifice to afford. My fiancé and I skipped vacations, ate at home instead of dining out, and even delayed upgrading our car just to keep the payments steady. It was the kind of place that left people breathless the moment they stepped in. And when I told my cousin about it, I thought I was sharing joy, not giving her ammunition. She had always been competitive with me, though I brushed it off as family quirks. She copied my hairstyles in high school, borrowed my clothes without asking, and once even went out with a guy she knew I liked just to see if she could get him. But I never thought she'd take things this far. It started subtly. She kept asking about my planning process, wanting to know how I managed to secure such a sought-after venue, what package I booked, and how flexible they were with dates. I assumed she was just curious, or maybe even a little envious. But then, out of nowhere, she announced to the family that she and her boyfriend had gotten engaged. At first, I was thrilled for her. I thought, how wonderful, we'd get to share this season of love together. But the thrill curdled into shock when I realized she had booked her wedding at the exact same venue just 1 week before mine. And worse, she was telling everyone that it had been her idea first. My heart nearly stopped when I confronted her, and she shrugged it off with a smirk, saying, "It's not like you own the place." But the real dagger came later, when I discovered that she wasn't just copying me, she was actively sabotaging me. Somehow, she managed to sweet talk or bribe someone at the venue into accidentally double booking and then bumping my date, telling me I'd have to push mine back because hers had already been finalized in the system. Imagine standing there, clutching your phone, as the venue manager, who had been warm and cooperative all along, suddenly tells you that your carefully planned date no longer exists, and your cousin is now the rightful bride of the estate. I felt sick. Every penny I had paid, every plan I had made, it all came crashing down with one email and a hollow apology. My family, instead of rallying to my defense, tried to smooth things over, urging me not to make a scene, saying things like, "It's just one day," or "You can find another place." They didn't understand. This wasn't just about the venue, it was about betrayal, about being robbed of something I had poured my heart and soul into. My cousin strutted around like she had won some invisible competition, flashing her new ring and gloating about how she couldn't wait for her magical day at the estate. I could see it in her eyes. She thought she had beaten me, humiliated me, proven she was superior. And for a few weeks, I let myself wallow in despair, scrolling through endless second-choice venues that felt like dim shadows compared to the estate. But then, a fire lit inside me. No, she wasn't going to steal my thunder. No, she wasn't going to waltz into my dream venue, wave to our family, and stand in the same spot I was supposed to, as if she had earned it. If she thought she could humiliate me, she had underestimated how far I was willing to go to protect what was mine. And that's when I began to plot. Not with anger clouding my vision, but with cold precision, like a chess player preparing to corner her opponent. I began digging, researching, and uncovering every detail of her so-called dream wedding. And what I found gave me the sharpest weapon of all. She couldn't afford it. Not really. She had stretched herself thin, throwing deposits around she couldn't back up, relying on credit cards and her parents' dwindling patience. The estate had demanded a final payment months before the date, and she didn't have it. I smiled when I learned this because suddenly the game had shifted. She had stolen my day, but she couldn't sustain the theft. All I had to do was wait and then strip. The moment I realized my cousin couldn't actually afford the venue she had snatched from me, everything shifted. Because instead of feeling powerless and humiliated, I suddenly had leverage. Real, tangible leverage that could not only restore what was mine, but also expose her arrogance to everyone who thought she had somehow outshined me. So, I started playing my cards very carefully, keeping my mouth shut and smiling at family gatherings while she rambled on about her plans, her vision board, her designer gown, her bridal party, and all the little details she was supposedly paying for, when in reality, I knew she was living on fumes. I could see the cracks in her facade when she thought nobody was watching, the late-night phone calls to the venue, the arguments with her boyfriend about money, the way her parents' voices grew colder every time she begged them for another loan, and the constant juggling of credit cards that she assumed nobody noticed. But I noticed everything. I waited until the deadline for her final payment was just weeks away. Then I reached out to the venue manager, a polite man who had once been frustrated with me, but was now clearly tired of dealing with my cousin's excuses and half-promises, and I asked a simple question. Had she paid in full yet? The hesitation in his voice told me everything I needed to know. No, she hadn't. And the clock was ticking, because if the balance wasn't cleared, the contract would dissolve and the date would be up for grabs. My heart thundered as I realized the sweetest revenge wasn't going to be loud or dramatic, it was going to be elegant, silent, and devastating. So I scraped together the rest of my savings, cashed out one of the bonds my fiancé and I had set aside, and made a bold move. I offered to settle the full amount, immediately, in cash, for that very same date if, and this was the crucial part, if the venue would reinstate my contract and cancel hers once her payment deadline passed. The manager paused, probably weighing his conscience against the reality of running a business, but in the end, money talks, and I walked away from that meeting with a written agreement tucked neatly into my bag like a sword ready to strike. Now, the hardest part was waiting, but I wasn't going to sit idly by. No, I decided to watch her dig her own grave. At brunch with our family, she bragged about how her custom centerpieces were being hand-delivered from Italy, how her cake designer was world-renowned, though everyone knew it was just a local baker, and how her dress fitting made her look like a queen. And while the others smiled and nodded, I sat quietly, sipping my coffee, knowing she hadn't even paid for the walls around her so-called fairy tale. The day of her payment deadline finally arrived, and I knew something had gone wrong for her when she posted a cryptic Instagram story with a black screen and the words, "Some people just don't want me to be happy," plastered over it, followed by a flurry of calls to her parents and fiancé that ended with a slammed phone and tears at her eyes. She couldn't pay, and the venue had officially terminated her contract. That very afternoon, I received confirmation that the date was mine again, fully paid, legally binding, and locked into stone. And I sat on my couch with the contract in my hands, laughing until tears rolled down my cheeks, because the very thing she had stolen was now mine again, but with a twist. It had cost her everything. Of course, I wasn't content to keep this victory hidden because what good is revenge if it doesn't echo? So I kept my secret close to my chest until the night of our uncle's birthday dinner, when the whole family gathered and she made a show of announcing that her venue had unfortunately fallen through due to unprofessional management and how she was considering simpler options because she was done with the drama. And before anyone could murmur sympathy, I reached into my purse, pulled out the glossy brochure from the estate, placed it on the table, and, with the sweetest smile I could muster, announced that my wedding would still be taking place there on the exact date she had lost. The silence was electric. Her face drained of color, her fork clattered against her plate, and my aunt gasped audibly as realization dawned across the room. My cousin stammered, trying to accuse me of interfering, but I didn't raise my voice or lose my composure. I simply said, "You never paid for it." I did. End of story.
The way she looked at me like a trapped animal, cornered and exposed, was more satisfying than any shouted confrontation could ever be. And though she tried to backpedal, to spin the narrative into me being obsessed with one-upping her, everyone could see the truth. She had been reckless, greedy, and delusional, and I simply claimed what was rightfully mine. That night, as I walked out of the restaurant hand in hand with my fiancé, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because I had humiliated her, though that part was delicious, but because I had proven to myself that I wasn't weak, I wasn't disposable, and I certainly wasn't going to let anyone, family or not, strip me of my happiness without a fight. The whispers in the family grew after that, some calling me ruthless, others admiring my poise, but I didn't care what label they chose because at the end of the day, my wedding was back on track. My cousin was left scrambling for a cheap community center she could barely decorate, and I had taught her the most painful lesson of all. You can try to steal my thunder, but I will always be willing to take back what is mine, and I will do it so queenly, so perfectly, that you'll never see it coming until it's too late.
When my wedding day finally arrived, after months of chaos, betrayal, and the sweetest reclamation of what was rightfully mine, I woke up with a clarity I can barely describe, the kind that settles into your bones when you know that not only are you about to marry the love of your life, but also that the person who tried to sabotage you is going to have to watch from the sidelines as her carefully constructed facade crumbles, and I wanted to savor every second of it. I slipped into my gown, layers of silk and lace that floated around me like a cloud, and as my bridesmaids fussed with my veil, I caught my reflection in the mirror and thought, this is what victory looks like. The estate had never looked more beautiful. Ivory roses lined the staircase, golden light poured through stained glass windows, and the chandeliers glittered like constellations brought down to earth. Guests gasped when they arrived, whispering about the grandeur, the elegance, and how perfect it all was. But I was listening for one reaction only, the sound of my cousin choking on her own envy. Yes, she came. Of course she did. She wouldn't dare miss it, because missing it would mean admitting defeat outright, and she was too stubborn for that. So she showed up in a dress that screamed, "Look at me," sequins clashing with the dignity of the venue, her smile tight and brittle as she made her rounds, pretending she was happy for me, when in reality, every glance at the decor, the flowers, the estate itself was slicing her open. I caught her eye when I walked down the aisle, my arm looped through my father's, and the look on her face was priceless. Her jaw tightened, her lips pressed into a thin line, and she looked like she might actually faint from the force of her own rage. My fiancé, waiting for me at the altar, looked at me with such love and certainty that all the background noise, the whispers, the silent war between me and my cousin, faded into insignificance, because in that moment, I knew the only thing that truly mattered was us, standing there, ready to begin our life together. Still, I'd be lying if I said the satisfaction of seeing her squirm didn't add an extra sparkle to the day. The ceremony flowed beautifully, vows exchanged with tears and laughter, and as we kissed for the first time as husband and wife, the crowd erupted into cheers, petals raining down on us, while I glimpsed my cousin, clapping half-heartedly, her eyes glistening not with joy, but with the bitterness of someone who had lost everything. At the reception, held in the grand ballroom with its soaring ceilings and gilded accents, the real unraveling began. She couldn't keep her mask on any longer, not when everyone was talking about how classy and well put together everything was, not when people whispered that they were relieved my wedding was here instead of wherever she was going to have hers. I overheard two aunts saying, "Can you imagine if she had tried to pull this off? It would have been a disaster." And my cousin, who was sitting just a table away, went stiff as a board, her wineglass trembling in her hand. She made a few digs here and there, trying to cut me down, complimenting my dress in a tone that dripped with sarcasm, asking loudly if the cake was store-bought, but each attempt fell flat, drowned out by the genuine love and happiness radiating from everyone around me.
And then came the toasts. My maid of honor, my best friend since childhood, delivered a speech so heartfelt and glowing that even my stoic grandfather wiped a tear from his eye, and my new husband's brother followed with jokes and anecdotes that had the room roaring with laughter. When it was my turn to thank everyone, I couldn't resist one final elegant strike. I stood, my glass raised, and said, "This venue is more than just a place. It's a symbol of love, sacrifice, and perseverance. It represents all the hard work and dedication that went into making this day possible. We knew what we wanted, and we fought for it, because that's what marriage is all about, fighting for what matters most." The room erupted in applause, and though I never named her, every single person knew exactly who I was addressing. My cousin's face burned crimson, her jaw twitching, and she excused herself from the table, disappearing into the hall for nearly an hour. Rumors swirled that she was crying in the bathroom, and though part of me felt a sliver of pity, it was quickly buried under the satisfaction of justice. Later in the evening, as the music swelled and guests filled the dance floor, she returned, mascara smudged and temper frayed, and she cornered me near the dessert table, hissing that I was vindictive and that I had ruined everything for her. I looked her straight in the eye, and without raising my voice, simply said, "No, you ruined it for yourself. I just took back what was mine." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, and before she could spit more venom, my husband appeared at my side, placing a protective arm around me, and we walked away, leaving her fuming and alone. By the time the night ended, after the cake had been cut and the last dance danced, I felt not only victorious, but liberated. My cousin had tried to steal my joy, my thunder, my future, but in the end, all she stole was her own dignity, while I stood surrounded by love, laughter, and the knowledge that I had won. Not just the battle for the venue, but the war for my own happiness.
In the weeks and months that followed my wedding, the ripple effects of what had happened continued to unfold like a long, slow symphony of poetic justice. And while I was busy settling into newlywed bliss, honeymooning on a sunlit beach with my husband, decorating our first home together, and savoring the warmth of a future we had fought so hard to protect, my cousin was unraveling, piece by piece, her once carefully curated image of superiority collapsing under the weight of her own choices. Word spread quickly through the family and our wider circle of friends. People talked, as they always do, and the story of how she had stolen my venue only to lose it and watch me reclaim it became the kind of cautionary tale that clung to her reputation like a stubborn stain. Invitations to social gatherings dwindled because nobody wanted the drama of her bitter tantrums, and even when she did attend, her sharp tongue and sour expressions alienated people further. Her parents, embarrassed by the spectacle she had caused, grew distant, refusing to bankroll her reckless spending anymore, and her fiancé, well, that imploded spectacularly. I heard from a mutual friend that their relationship began to crumble shortly after the wedding because he couldn't stomach the humiliation of being dragged into her schemes, nor could he forgive the mountain of debt she had piled onto their shared accounts trying to keep up appearances. By the time autumn rolled around, she had moved back into her parents' house, her engagement ring quietly returned, her pride shattered. For a while I didn't hear much from her directly, though there were always whispers, angry posts she made online about toxic families, the sudden disappearance of her once daily Instagram updates, and the rare sight of her skulking at the back of family gatherings, unable to meet my eyes. And though I could have gloated, though I could have rubbed salt in the wound with smug remarks or cutting jabs, I chose instead to hold my head high and let silence speak louder than words. Because nothing burns more than watching someone you tried to destroy thrive without acknowledging your existence. I focused on building my marriage, on nurturing joy, on showing that I had no time for petty vendettas, because my life was too full of love and laughter. Still, I won't pretend that I didn't savor the quiet vindication every time someone leaned over at a family dinner to say, "Your wedding was the most beautiful one I've ever been to," or when distant relatives who had once praised my cousin's confidence now clucked their tongues and said, "She really got what was coming to her." It was like watching justice play out in slow motion, not because I had to force it, but because she had engineered her own downfall, and I had simply refused to let her drag me down with her. A year later, on our anniversary, my husband and I returned to the estate for a small dinner, just the two of us. And as we sat in the same ballroom where we had danced our first dance, I felt a swell of pride, not just for the wedding itself, but for the resilience it represented. That building was more than just a venue now. It was a monument to my strength, a reminder that I had faced betrayal from someone I loved and come out not just unscathed, but victorious. My cousin, meanwhile, had become a shadow of her former self, working long hours at a job she hated to claw her way out of debt. Her friendships strained, her relationships fractured, and though I never wished her ruin, I couldn't help but see the symmetry in it all. She had tried to steal my day, my happiness, my future, but in the end, the only thing she succeeded in stealing was her own chance at joy. The family eventually stopped bringing it up, not out of respect for her, but out of exhaustion, because every mention of it sent her spiraling into bitter tirades. And I, for my part, let it fade into the past, secure in the knowledge that my revenge had been complete without ever needing to lift a finger beyond reclaiming what was mine. And that, I realized, was the true beauty of it all. Revenge doesn't always have to be loud, messy, or cruel. Sometimes it is as simple as patience, as elegant as precision, and as satisfying as standing tall while your enemy collapses under the weight of their own hubris. My cousin may have stolen my wedding day in theory, but in practice, I lived it, I owned it, and I carried it with me into a life she could never touch. And whenever I think back on it, whenever I walk past our wedding album or see the framed photo of us beneath the estate's grand archway, I smile, because I know that while she spent her energy trying to outshine me, I chose instead to shine on my own. And in the end, that light not only blinded her, but illuminated everything I had fought for, everything she could never take, and everything that was always meant to be mine. Looking back now, with time softening the sharp edges of the ordeal but never erasing its lessons, I realized that what began as the most painful betrayal of my life became one of the greatest turning points in shaping who I am and how I choose to live. Because my cousin's attempt to steal my wedding day was never just about a date or a venue. It was about power, control, and a desperate attempt to prove she was better than me. And when she failed so spectacularly, I not only reclaimed what was mine, but also learned that true strength doesn't come from retaliating with venom. It comes from standing tall, waiting patiently, and striking only when the moment is right. For months after the wedding, people still asked me about the drama, still whispered their versions of the story in hushed tones at gatherings, or messaged me privately to say how much they admired the way I handled myself. And while part of me relished the validation, the bigger part of me simply smiled and moved on, because the truth was, I didn't need anyone's approval. I had already won where it mattered most. My marriage blossomed with a stability that my cousin's relationships never seemed to touch. My husband and I built a life of quiet joys and shared ambitions, from traveling to places we'd always dreamed about, to supporting each other's careers, and eventually preparing to start a family of our own. While she stumbled from one failed relationship to another, each one leaving her a little more bitter, a little more convinced that the world owed her something she had never earned. Occasionally, I would see her attempts at reinvention online. Dramatic posts about how she was done with toxic people, vague claims about pursuing new passions. But the likes dwindled, the comments thinned, and it was clear that people had grown tired of her theatrics. Meanwhile, I flourished, not because I was trying to outdo her, but because I had finally stopped looking sideways and focused only on my own path. And that, I think, is the greatest revenge of all, to succeed without ever acknowledging the one who tried to drag you down. I sometimes wonder if she lies awake at night thinking about that day, replaying the moment she saw me walking down the aisle in the very venue she thought she had stolen, hearing the applause, the laughter, the joy she wanted for herself but could never hold. And if so, I wonder if she realizes that her downfall wasn't crafted by my hands, but by her own greed and arrogance. Life has a way of giving back what you put into it, and while I poured love, sacrifice, and perseverance into my dream, she poured envy, deceit, and selfishness into hers, and the universe simply delivered the outcomes we had each earned. The older I get, the more I understand that not every battle requires swords drawn or voices raised. Sometimes the most devastating victories are the quiet ones, where your enemy falls by their own blade, and all you have to do is step gracefully into the space they vacated. My cousin and I still cross paths from time to time, holidays, weddings, funerals, and though she can barely meet my eyes, I always greet her with a calm smile,
not because I've forgotten, but because I want her to see that I carry no bitterness, no weight from what she did, only freedom. That, more than anything, is what unsettles her, I think. The fact that I'm not haunted, not hurt, not angry anymore, but thriving, happy, and untouched, while she is the one burdened by the ghost of her own choices. And maybe that's the moral buried inside all of this, the message I wish I could pass on to anyone listening. When someone tries to rob you of your joy, your peace, or your dreams, don't waste your energy stooping to their level or clawing back in desperation. Instead, hold fast to your truth, wait for the cracks in their armor to appear, and trust that what is yours will always find its way back to you if you fight for it with patience and dignity. Revenge isn't always about cruelty. Sometimes it's about reclaiming your place with such grace and precision that the world can't help but admire your poise, even as your enemy crumbles. My cousin stole my wedding day, or so she thought. But in the end, I stood at the altar, surrounded by love, laughter, and the family who finally saw her for who she really was, while she stood in the shadows, watching the fairy tale slip through her fingers, powerless to stop it. And that memory, etched into the walls of that grand estate, into the smiles of every guest who attended, into the vows my husband and I spoke with trembling voices and joyous tears, will never fade, no matter how many years pass. Because that day wasn't just a wedding. It was a declaration of resilience, of triumph, and of unshakable love, and of the fact that no matter who tries to steal your thunder, if you remain steadfast, you can always, always take it back.